The morning she walked into Blackwood Tower, her safe, ordinary life quietly ended, even if she didn't realize it yet. Ava Miller stood in the massive glass lobby clutching her resume, her heart racing as she looked up at the towering floors above her. This job was supposed to be simple, a stable position, decent pay, and a chance to rebuild her life after years of struggle. She never imagined it would place her directly in the orbit of Ethan Blackwood, billionaire CEO, ruthless businessman, and a man known for breaking deals and people with equal precision. From the moment she stepped onto the executive floor, tension filled the air. Assistants whispered, heels echoed sharply against marble floors, and everyone moved with urgent purpose. Then she saw him. Tall, composed, cold-eyed, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit that screamed power without saying a word. Ethan Blackwood didn't look at people, he assessed them. When his gaze finally landed on Ava, it lingered just long enough to make her breath hitch. "You're late," he said flatly, even though she wasn't. That was the moment she understood something dangerous. This man controlled everything around him, and he expected absolute obedience. Her first hours were a blur of impossible demands, rapid-fire instructions, and icy silence. Ethan didn't yell. He didn't need to. His calm authority was far more intimidating. Ava struggled to keep up, making small mistakes, bracing herself for termination, but instead of firing her, Ethan watched, studied, noticed things no one else did, the way she corrected errors quietly, how she didn't crumble under pressure, how she met his gaze without flinching even when her hands shook. By the end of the day, exhausted and emotionally drained, Ava realized she hadn't just landed a job, she had walked straight into a world of power, secrets, and unspoken rules. And Ethan Blackwood realized something far more dangerous. For the first time in years, someone had entered his perfectly controlled life and unsettled it. As Ava left the building that night, the city lights reflected in the glass walls behind her, she felt a strange mix of fear and determination. She didn't know it yet, but destiny had already begun to move. Becoming the billionaire CEO's assistant wasn't just a career step, it was the beginning of a connection neither of them had planned, and one that would slowly turn her into his greatest weakness. By the second week, Ava had learned that working for Ethan Blackwood was less like a job and more like surviving a silent war. The office ran on precision, fear, and unspoken rules, all orbiting around one man whose presence alone could shift the atmosphere of an entire floor. Ethan was relentless. Meetings stacked without breaks, schedules changed without warning, decisions demanded instantly. Yet Ava adapted. She learned his rhythms, anticipated his needs, corrected mistakes before they were noticed, and absorbed pressure without complaint. What unsettled Ethan wasn't her efficiency, it was her calm resilience. She didn't seek his approval, didn't fawn or fear him the way others did. She simply did her job, quietly and with an unwavering focus that began to catch his attention in ways he hadn't expected. The tension between them grew subtle but undeniable. In boardrooms filled with powerful executives, Ethan's sharp gaze often flicked toward Ava without reason, lingering just a moment too long. He noticed the way she clenched her jaw under stress but never faltered, how she carried herself with quiet dignity despite the intimidating environment. One late evening, when the office had emptied and the city lights flickered beyond the glass walls, Ava made a small but critical correction to a financial report moments before Ethan presented it to international investors. The deal succeeded, flawlessly. Ethan said nothing at first, but when the meeting ended, he stopped beside her desk. "You saved the deal," he said simply. No praise, no warmth, yet for Ethan Blackwood those 4 words were monumental. Ava nodded, heart pounding, unaware that this was the first crack in his carefully guarded emotional armor. Behind his composed exterior, Ethan was unsettled. Control had always been his strength. Emotions were liabilities he had buried long ago. Yet Ava's presence disrupted the balance he had built his empire upon. He found himself remembering small details about her, the way she preferred her coffee, the exhaustion she hid behind professionalism, the faint sadness in her eyes when she thought no one was watching. He told himself it was strategic awareness, nothing more. But when another executive snapped at Ava during a meeting, Ethan's response was immediate and cold. "Speak to my assistant with respect," he said, voice sharp enough to silence the room. The shock on everyone's faces mirrored Ava's own. Protection was not something Ethan Blackwood offered lightly, and certainly not without reason. Ava felt the shift too. She sensed the invisible line tightening between them, heavy with unspoken tension. She reminded herself constantly that this was just a job, that powerful men like Ethan Blackwood didn't fall, didn't soften, didn't care. Yet there were moments, fleeting, dangerous moments, when his gaze softened, when exhaustion replaced control, when silence between them felt charged rather than cold. One night, as rain streaked down the windows and the city hummed below, Ethan paused beside her desk after another endless workday. "You should go home," he said quietly. Concern, unmistakable and unguarded, slipped into his voice before he could stop it. Ava looked up, surprised. "So should you," she replied gently. For the first time, Ethan smiled, not the sharp, strategic kind, but something real, brief, and unguarded. That night, both of them lay awake in separate worlds, haunted by the same realization. Ava understood that the man she worked for was not just powerful, he was deeply alone. And Ethan realized something far more dangerous. Ava Miller was no longer just his assistant. She was becoming a presence he noticed, relied on, and unconsciously protected. A weakness forming quietly in the heart of a man who had built his life on never needing anyone. By the third month, the line between professional duty and emotional awareness had grown dangerously thin. Ava had mastered Ethan Blackwood's world, the schedules that changed without warning, the meetings that demanded perfection, the silence that carried more weight than words. Yet what unsettled her most wasn't the pressure, it was the way Ethan had begun to depend on her presence. He asked for her opinion more often now, trusted her instincts during negotiations, and allowed her into spaces no assistant had ever entered before. Late-night strategy sessions stretched into quiet moments of shared understanding, where the city lights outside became a distant blur, and the tension between them filled the room like electricity waiting to spark. Ethan noticed the shift too, even as he fought against it. He had spent years building emotional walls so thick nothing could penetrate them. Vulnerability had no place in his empire, and yet Ava slipped through the cracks without force or intention. She listened when he spoke, challenged him when necessary, and never tried to impress him. One evening, during a tense acquisition negotiation, Ava caught an error others had missed, a clause that would have cost Blackwood Industries millions. When Ethan shut the deal successfully, relief flickered across his face before he masked it. Later, alone in his office, he said quietly, "I trust you." The words landed heavily between them. Trust was something Ethan Blackwood did not give. It was earned through loyalty and tested through fire. Ava felt the weight of it settle on her heart. The attraction neither of them wanted to name became impossible to ignore. It lived in stolen glances, in pauses that stretched too long, in the way Ethan's gaze softened whenever Ava entered a room. She noticed how exhaustion carved shadows beneath his eyes, how loneliness hid behind his authority. And Ethan noticed everything, the way Ava bit her lip when she concentrated, how she held herself together even when stress pressed down hard, how her presence grounded him in moments when the world demanded more than he could give. One rainy night, after another endless workday, the elevator stalled between floors. The confined space amplified everything. The silence, the proximity, the awareness of each other. Neither spoke, yet the tension was suffocating. When the lights flickered back on and the doors finally opened, both of them stepped out knowing something had shifted irreversibly. But with closeness came fear. Ava reminded herself that she was an employee, temporary, replaceable. Ethan was untouchable, powerful, a man whose world crushed weakness without mercy. And Ethan reminded himself that attachment was dangerous, especially when his past was littered with betrayals that had taught him to trust no one. Yet fate refused to listen to logic. One late evening, Ava found Ethan alone in his office, staring out at the city, shoulders tense. "Do you ever stop?" she asked softly. He didn't turn. "If I stop, everything falls apart," he replied. The honesty in his voice startled them both. Ava stepped closer, not touching him, but present. "You don't have to carry everything alone," she said. The silence that followed was heavy, fragile, and profoundly intimate. That night, they crossed no physical boundaries, yet something far more dangerous occurred: emotional connection. Ava realized that Ethan Blackwood was not just her boss, he was a man shaped by loss, pressure, and solitude. And Ethan realized that Ava Miller was no longer just his assistant, she was the one person who saw through the armor and stayed anyway. The attraction between them was no longer subtle, it was powerful, restrained, and dangerously close to becoming something neither of them could control. The change didn't arrive loudly. It crept in through small fractures in Ethan Blackwood's perfect control. The boardroom, once a place where he ruled without hesitation, began to feel different when Ava was present. Her opinions were no longer optional, they mattered. And that alone unsettled the executives who had grown used to Ethan's emotional distance. Whispers started, subtle at first, then sharper. They noticed the way Ethan's voice softened when he addressed her, the way his attention followed her across the room. Ava sensed it too. The office that once felt intimidating now carried an undercurrent of judgment, curiosity, and quiet resentment. She told herself to ignore it, to remain professional, but the weight of it pressed against her every day. The tension peaked when Ethan's former fiancée, Victoria Hale, returned unexpectedly, elegant, ambitious, and very aware of her history with him. She moved through the office like she still belonged there, her gaze sharp when it landed on Ava. "So you're the assistant," Victoria said with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. Ava nodded calmly, unaware that she had just stepped into a storm she never invited. Ethan's reaction was immediate. His posture stiffened, his jaw tightened, and for the first time Ava saw something like unease flicker across his face. That night, she overheard fragments of conversation, betrayal, trust broken, a past that had taught Ethan to bury his heart beneath ambition and control. Later, Ava found Ethan alone in his office, the city lights reflecting in his tired eyes. "You don't talk about your past," she said softly. He exhaled slowly, as if deciding whether to retreat or finally speak. "Because the past taught me that caring comes at a cost," he replied. His voice was steady, but the pain beneath it was undeniable. Ava didn't push. She simply stayed. And for Ethan Blackwood, that quiet presence was more powerful than any comfort he'd ever known. The walls he had spent years building began to tremble, weakened by something as simple and dangerous as being understood. The breaking point came during a charity gala where power, wealth, and appearances mattered more than truth. Ava attended as part of Ethan's team, elegant yet out of place among the elite. When another executive openly flirted with her, Ethan's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. His gaze darkened, his control slipping just enough to reveal jealousy, raw, unfiltered, and impossible to hide. Later that night, in a quiet corridor away from prying eyes, Ethan confronted Ava. "You belong here," he said firmly, the words heavy with meaning beyond professionalism. Ava's heart raced. "I don't belong to anyone," she replied, voice steady but trembling beneath the surface. The silence between them was charged, electric, and dangerously intimate. That night, Ethan stood alone on his balcony, haunted by the realization that Ava was no longer just a weakness, she was a risk he couldn't afford and couldn't let go of. And Ava, lying awake in her apartment, understood that her feelings were no longer something she could deny or contain. They were standing on the edge of something irreversible, a connection that threatened power, reputation, and control. Everything unraveled faster than either of them had expected. The pressure that had been building silently finally erupted when a hostile takeover threat surfaced against Blackwood Industries, targeting Ethan's most vulnerable division. Board members panicked, executives turned cautious, and old enemies resurfaced with calculated precision. Ava watched Ethan retreat behind his familiar wall of cold control, working endlessly, sleeping less, carrying the weight of the empire alone, just as he always had. But this time it was different. This time she could see the cracks clearly, the exhaustion, the anger, the fear he refused to name, and worst of all, the way he began to distance himself from her, not out of indifference, but out of fear of how much she mattered. The breaking point came late one night when Ava discovered she had been deliberately excluded from a critical strategy meeting. Hurt and confused, she confronted Ethan in his office, her voice calm but shaking beneath the surface. "You shut me out," she said. Ethan didn't deny it. "I can't afford distractions," he replied coldly, though his eyes betrayed him. "This company is under attack." Ava stepped closer, her heart pounding. "I'm not a distraction," she said softly. "I'm someone who cares." The word hung between them like a spark near gasoline. Ethan's composure finally shattered. "That's the problem," he snapped. "Caring is dangerous. It costs everything." Silence followed. Heavy, suffocating, unavoidable. Ava's voice broke as she spoke the truth she had been holding back for months. "You don't get to decide what I feel," she said, "and you don't get to push me away just because you're afraid." Ethan turned away, gripping the edge of his desk, as if the ground beneath him was unstable. "You think I don't know what this is?" he said quietly. "You think I don't feel it every time you walk into the room? You are the one thing in my life I can't control, and that terrifies me." The confession was raw, unguarded, and irreversible. But fate wasn't finished testing them. The following morning, Ava was abruptly reassigned, a board decision driven by power, fear, and whispered accusations of impropriety. The implication was clear. She was a liability. Ethan arrived too late to stop it. Watching Ava pack her desk in silence shattered something inside him. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his voice heavy with regret and determination. Ava met his gaze, pain and strength intertwined. "Sometimes," she replied, "walking away is the only way to survive." And with that, she left, not just the office, but the only place where she had felt seen, valued, and dangerously alive. That night, Ethan stood alone in his penthouse, the city lights offering no comfort. For the first time in his life, success felt hollow. Power meant nothing without the woman who had become his anchor, his clarity, his greatest weakness. He realized too late that protecting her by pushing her away had cost him everything that truly mattered. Months passed, but the emptiness Ava felt never truly faded. She had rebuilt her life with quiet strength, a new job, a smaller firm, a calmer routine. Yet something vital remained missing. She told herself she had escaped a world that was too powerful, too dangerous for her heart, but late at night, memories of Ethan lingered like unfinished sentences. Meanwhile, Ethan's world continued to crumble in ways no balance sheet could measure. Though he successfully defended Blackwood Industries from the takeover, victory felt meaningless. The penthouse felt colder, meetings felt empty, and every decision echoed with the absence of the woman who once challenged him, grounded him, and saw him beyond the empire. He finally understood the truth he had been running from. Losing Ava had been the greatest failure of his life. Driven by regret and clarity, Ethan made a decision no one expected. He dismantled the very system that had pushed Ava out, restructuring the board, exposing corruption, and publicly taking responsibility for his mistakes. The media buzzed, investors panicked, but Ethan didn't hesitate. For the first time, he chose love over control. Then, without announcements or security, he found Ava. Standing outside her modest office building, stripped of power and pride, Ethan spoke not as a billionaire CEO, but as a man who had finally learned what it meant to be vulnerable. He admitted his fear, his failures, and the truth he could no longer deny, that she wasn't his weakness, she was his strength. Ava listened in silence, tears threatening to fall as every wall she had built began to crack. She confessed how deeply she had been hurt, how walking away had nearly broken her, but also how it had taught her her worth. "I won't disappear to fit into your world," she said firmly. Ethan nodded, his voice steady yet emotional. "Then let me step into yours," he replied. It wasn't a grand gesture or a promise of luxury, it was a promise of equality, respect, and love. In that moment, Ava realized this was not the man she had left behind. This was someone who had changed because of her, for her. Their reunion wasn't dramatic or rushed, it was honest. They rebuilt slowly, choosing trust over fear, partnership over power. Ethan remained the CEO, but no longer alone. Ava returned, not as an assistant, but as an equal consultant, her voice respected, her presence welcomed. Together, they redefined what success looked like, not measured in billions, but in peace, growth, and shared dreams. In the final moments of their story, Ava stood beside Ethan at a charity gala, not hidden in the shadows, but proudly by his side. As he looked at her, the city lights reflected a future he once believed he didn't deserve. She had entered his life as an assistant, challenged his empire, broken his walls, and taught him that true power was not control, it was love.